fact, I never hear people say, "Man, I just have way too much time on my hands." What I usually hear is, "There isn't enough time in the day to do all I need to do." I imagine that as you look at your work schedule or your kids' sports schedule, or look at all the repairs around your house that aren't being repaired, you'd do anything for more time. And while I find myself constantly wanting more time, I also find myself wanting more grace. In my experience, the less time I feel like I have, the more grace I feel like I need. Let me give you an example. Not that long ago, I was pulled over for speeding. Why? Because I was late, of course. And when the officer pulled me over, what did I ask for? Grace. I think our lack of time feeds our need for grace. Whether I'm late for a meeting or late to get home, I'm constantly asking for grace. And for the most part, people extend it, except for that police officer. But grace is something that can be given as a gift to somebody. At the heart of the story of the prodigal son sits this evasive concept of grace. And like time, almost everybody feels like they could use more grace. Think about it. Maybe someone isn't speaking to you anymore because they're mad at you or holding a grudge. Maybe you got busted and you're afraid of what's going to happen next. Maybe you feel misunderstood in a relationship and you just want some grace. Maybe you've crossed a line and all you want is some grace. When we really think about it, grace is the one thing we all crave from each other. And isn't it true that most of us feel like we show more grace than others, but we receive less of it? We feel like grace is a gift that we're not getting enough of, even though we believe we're doing a great job of actually giving it. In the Gospel of John, John wrote that Jesus was full of grace and truth. Now, isn't that interesting? One of the things Jesus brought with him into the world was the thing we crave the most from each other. The story of the prodigal son is one of the most famous stories Jesus told. And at the heart of it, it's a story all about grace. It's a story about a God who extends to us what we all really want. As we've said in the last few weeks, a really diverse crowd was present for the story. It was full of law keepers and lawbreakers. The law keepers, the Pharisees, had legitimate concerns with the lawbreakers, the tax collectors. Now, the tax collectors essentially were professional extortionists. But instead of punishing them, Jesus ate meals with them. And that made the Pharisees think Jesus doesn't take sin really seriously. See, in the world of Jesus, the first 5 books of the Old Testament laid out a moral and social framework. The book of Leviticus gave God's people a framework of laws to live by. Jesus chose to eat with lawbreakers, knowing that the Levitical law specifically addressed what an extortionist would need to do to reconcile their wrongs. Verses like this make it very clear. If anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving a neighbor about something entrusted to them or left in their care or about something stolen, or if they cheat their neighbor, or if they find lost property and lie about it, or if they swear falsely about any such sin that people may commit, when they sin in any of these ways and realize their guilt, they must return what they have stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to them, or the lost property they found, or whatever it was they swore falsely about. They must make restitution in full, add 1/5 of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day they present their guilt offering. So according to the law, in order for the tax collectors to reconcile their lying and their cheating, there needed to be repayment. In other words, the law clearly stated reconciliation is repayment with interest. But Jesus wasn't demanding the tax collectors repay the people they had stolen from. He didn't demand that they did what was required for repentance. Instead, he ate dinner with them. Since Jesus didn't address their sins, it probably appeared that he wasn't taking their sins seriously. And this most likely laid heavily on the minds of the Pharisees as Jesus ate freely with the thieves. Jesus responded to the tension by telling this story. We read this last week, but let's start here again. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to be a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death?" We don't know why the prodigal son left home. Whatever the reason, he packed his bags and left. Okay, let's pause here for a second. Because when I read the story of the prodigal son, it reminds me of all the pictures that I see online or on social media. Of like an incredible sunset or like a beautifully plated picture of food that people are about to eat at a hot new restaurant. But then when I get there, sometimes the reality doesn't measure up to what I saw online. In this story, Jesus showed how the pictures of sin are misleading. Jesus told the story of the prodigal son and said, "This is what sin is really like." When you pursue a life of sin and think it's going to set you free, you eventually realize that the picture that was promised you is actually false. Most of us can relate to that moment when, after a period of fun, we come to our senses and realize that we were ripped off. It's exactly what happened with the prodigal son. So what was Jesus' point? He understands the gravity of sin. And just because he was eating with sinners, it didn't mean he was dismissing their sin. Jesus points out the son's moment of clarity. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.'" So he got up and went to his father. We often think this is the turning point of the story, but it isn't. What was the prodigal's plan? To go home and repay his dad. Why? Because this was a culture that said reconciliation meant repayment. At this point, the Pharisees wanted to high-five Jesus. Yes! He needs to repay, and the tax collectors do too. Can't you just picture the tension that everyone was feeling at this moment in the story? I think there's something in all of us when we realize we've messed up that makes us want to fix it. I heard someone say recently, we need to meet God halfway. However, Jesus is telling us that halfway is too far for us to go. Because we can't fix what we've broken. We need God to do the heavy lifting. We need God to go all the way. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Now remember that at this point, the villagers would have seen the son returning and would have wanted to perform a shame ceremony. This prodigal son knew it was coming. But this, my friends, is the turning point of the story. When the father saw his son, he essentially outran anyone who would want to perform a shame ceremony over his son. Jesus wasn't just telling a story, he was painting a picture. And let me tell you something about that day and time. You see, men in the first century world did not run. It was considered shameful. In order to run, a man would have to hike up his robes, and you could live your entire life in a village like this and never see a man running. Knowing that, Jesus tells a story about a father who is willing to humiliate himself to spare his child from humiliation. That is powerful. Fast forward in the life of Jesus. And isn't that what Jesus demonstrated from the cross? That at the cross, the prodigal son story becomes flesh and blood, real life. Jesus humiliated himself to spare us from humiliation. The prodigal son didn't even try to repeat the line about working for his father. All he could do was receive his father's gift of grace. But the father said to his servants, "Quick! Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and the sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. On the surface, this seems like horrible parenting. If you had a son or daughter who ran away like that and squandered all they had, would you throw them a party when they came home? Or would you send them off to be rehabilitated? The point of this story is that not only does reconciliation happen before repayment, but reconciliation happens before rehabilitation. This is what makes Christianity so unique. Every other religion says the problem with humanity is a broken rule. Christianity, however, says the human problem isn't a broken rule, it's a broken relationship. And we celebrate when that relationship between God and sinner is reconciled. If we forget this, we will begin to treat rules as primary and people as secondary. For some of you, that's why you don't like Christianity. Maybe the house you grew up in made you feel like a rule was more important than a person. Or it's why you don't like the church, because you grew up in a church where every Sunday the message was fix and rehabilitate yourself. Ironically, when sermons like this were over, we'd all stand and sing Amazing Grace. In this kind of environment, where rules are elevated over people, we feel justified in treating people terribly. But Jesus paints a picture of the heart of God. And God values the relationship over the rule. If we forget this, we'll think we need to clean up before we can come to God. We'll look around at others and think we have to look like them before we can be reconciled to God. We don't. God offers you the gift of grace, the one thing we all want more of. You don't have to work for it. You don't have to repay for what you've done. You simply accept the gift. Once you've been reconciled to God, then you can become a part of rehab for sinners like the rest of us. That's what church is. It's not a courthouse for prosecutors. It's rehab for sinners. Can you imagine if this church became a place like that? Rehab happens slowly. When we become a Christian, as Francis Spufford says, God will grant us amnesty, but he will not grant us amnesia. We still have the sights and smells of the distant country on us. We often still carry souvenirs from our visits. But there's good news. None of that stops God from celebrating that we're home, because Jesus humiliated himself to spare us from humiliation. When we come back to God, he is there with open arms.